Okay, next video, or next, I guess, next content. So I did one of these there. Let's get 2 more OpenStax done, and then 5 Bibles. Sheesh. All right, so this is 9, 2, 2023. 1. Next is philosophy. Social, no, humanities, philosophy, PDF. Go to 5. Okay, let's move this over. Y'all, so grab me the water. Yeah. Drinking me some Liquid Death mountain water. Delicious stuff. It's $13 for an 8-pack of cans. So I think my plan is I'm going to do 2 a day, or I might do 3 a day. And then I'm going to need to buy some more of that Proud Source spring water and do like 2 of those a day, and then have like a quart of the gallon. I'm drinking the canned water simply because it's the same feeling as opening up a soda. I'm trying to break that habit. Okay. All right. Chapter 1. Introduction to Philosophy. Chapter outline. 1.1. What is philosophy? 1.2. How do philosophers arrive at truth? 1.3. Socrates is a paradigmatic historical philosopher. 1.4. An overview of contemporary philosophy. Introduction. Dang it. For most college students, an introduction to philosophy course is their first encounter with the study of philosophy. Unlike most of your other courses, philosophy is not something usually covered in high school. Yet, you are probably familiar with the term philosophy and may have some preconceived notion about what philosophy is and what philosophers do. Perhaps you have stayed up late at night talking with a friend or family about topics like free will or the existence of God. Perhaps, maybe, you have a friend who always talks about big ideas or asks tough questions that sound like riddles. Perhaps you think of them as philosophical, as you might be right. In this chapter, we will provide a brief introduction to the field of philosophy as a historical and academic discipline. This first chapter should prepare you for your philosophy course and give you a better idea of what it means to be a philosopher. As with all introductions, this one is just a start. Your job is to explore more, think more, read more, and write more like a philosopher. Soon, you may even find that you are doing philosophy. 1.1. What is philosophy? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify sages across historical traditions, explain the connection between ancient philosophy and the origin of the sciences, describe philosophy as a discipline that makes coherent sense of a whole, summarize the broad and diverse origins of philosophy. It is difficult to define philosophy. In fact, to do so is itself a philosophical activity, since philosophers are attempting to gain the broadest and most fundamental conception of the world as it exists. The world includes nature, consciousness, morality, beauty, and social organizations. So the content available for philosophy is both broad and deep. Because of this very nature, philosophy considers a range of subjects, and philosophers cannot automatically rule anything out. Whereas other disciplines allow for basic assumptions, philosophers cannot be bound by such assumptions. This open endedness makes philosophy a somewhat awkward and confusing subject for students. There are no easy answers to the questions of what philosophy studies or how one does philosophy. Nevertheless, in this chapter, we can make some progress on these questions by looking at past examples of philosophers, considering one compelling definition of philosophy, and looking at the way academic philosophers today actually practice philosophy. Historical origins of philosophy. One way to begin to understand philosophy is to look at its history. The historical origins of philosophical thinking and exploration vary around the globe. The word philosophy derives from ancient Greek, in which the philosopher is a lover or pursuer of wisdom. But the earliest Greek philosophers were not known as philosophers, they were simply known as sages. The sage tradition provides an early glimpse of philosophical thought in action. Sages are sometimes associated with mathematical and scientific discoveries, and at other times with their political impact. What unites these figures is that they demonstrate a willingness to be skeptical of traditions, a curiosity about the natural world and our place in it, and a commitment to applying reason to understand nature, human nature, and society better. The overview of the sage tradition that follows will give you a taste of philosophy's broad ambitions as well as its focus on complex relations between different areas of human knowledge. There are some examples of women who made contributions to philosophy and the sage tradition in Greece, India, and China, but these were patriarchal societies that did not provide many opportunities for women to participate in philosophical and political discussions. The sages of India, China, Africa, and Greece. In classical Indian philosophy and religion, sages play a central role in both religious mythology and in the practice of passing down teachings and instruction through generations. The seven sages, or Saptarishi, play an important role in Sanatana Dharma, the eternal duties that have come to be identified with Hinduism, but that predate the establishment of the religion. The seven sages are partially considered wise men and are said to be the authors of the ancient Indian text known as the Vedas. But they are partly mythic figures as well, who are said to have descended from the gods and whose reincarnation marks the passing of each age of Manu. The rishis tended to live monastic lives, and together they are thought of as spiritual and practical forerunners of Indian gurus or teachers, even up to today. They derive their wisdom in part from spiritual forces, but also from tapas, or the meditative, ascetic, and spiritual practices they perform to gain control over their bodies and minds. The stories of the rishis are part of the teachings that can constitute spiritual and philosophical practice in contemporary Hinduism. Figure 1.2 depicts a scene from the Matsya Purana, where Manu, the first man whose succession marks prehistorical ages of Earth, sits with the seven sages in a boat to protect them from a mythic flood that is said to have submerged the world. The king of serpents guides the boat, which is said to have contained seeds, plants, and animals saved by Manu from the flood. Despite the fact that classical Indian culture is patriarchal, women figures play an important role in the earliest writings of the Vedic tradition. These women figures are partly connected to the Indian conception of the fundamental forces of nature, energy, ability, strength, effort, and power, as feminine. This aspect of God was thought to be present as the creation of the world. The Rig Veda, the oldest Vedic writings, contains hymns that tell the story of Gosha, the daughter of Rishi Kakshavan, who had a debilitating skin condition, but devoted herself to spiritual practices to learn how to heal herself and eventually marry. Another woman, Maitreyi, is said to have married Rishi Yajnavalkya for the purpose of continuing her spiritual training. She was a devoted ascetic and is said to have composed 10 of the hymns of the Rig Veda. Additionally, there is a famous dialogue between Maitreyi and Yajnavalkya in the Upanishads about attachment to material possessions, which cannot give a person happiness, and the achievement of ultimate bliss through knowledge of the Absolute. Another woman sage named Gargi also participates in a celebrated dialogue with Yajnavalkya on natural philosophy and the fundamental elements and forces of the universe. Gargi is characterized as one of the most knowledgeable sages on the topic, though she ultimately concedes that Yajnavalkya has greater knowledge. In these brief episodes, these ancient Indian texts record instances of key women who attained a level of enlightenment and learning similar to their male counterparts. Unfortunately, this early equality between the sexes did not last. Over time, Indian culture became more patriarchal, confining women to a dependent and subservient role. Perhaps the most dramatic and cruel example of the effects of Indian patriarchy was the ritual practice of sati, in which a widow would sometimes immolate herself, partly in recognition of the fact that following the death of her husband, her current life on earth served no further purpose. Neither a widow's in laws nor society recognized her value. In similar fashion to the Indian tradition, the sage tradition is important for Chinese philosophy. Confucius, one of the greatest Chinese writers, often refers to ancient sages, emphasizing their importance for their discovery of technical skills essential to human civilization. For their role as rulers and wise leaders, and for their wisdom, this emphasis is in alignment with the Confucian appeal to a well ordered state under the guidance of a philosopher king. This point of view can be seen as in early stage sage figures identified by one of the greatest classical authors of the Chinese tradition as the nest builder and fire maker, or in another case, the flood controller. These names identify wise individuals with early technological discoveries. The Book of Changes, a classical Chinese text, identifies the five emperors as sages, including Yao and Shun, who are said to have built canoes and oars, attached carts to oxen, built double gates for defense, and fashioned bows and arrows. Emperor Shun is also said to have ruled during the time of a great flood when all of China was submerged. Yu is credited with having saved civilization by building canals and dams. These figures are praised not only for their political wisdom and long rule, but also for their filial piety and devotion to work. For instance, Mencius, a Confucian philosopher, relates a story of Shun's care for his blind father and wicked stepmother, while Yu is praised for his selfless devotion to work. In these ways, the Chinese philosophical traditions, such as Confucianism and Moism, associate key values of their philosophical enterprises with the great sages of their history. Whether the sages were, in fact, actual people, or as many scholars have concluded, mythical forebearers, they possess the essential human virtue of listening and responding to divine voices. This attribute can be inferred from the Chinese script for Shang, which bears the symbol of an ear as a prominent feature. So the sage is one who listens to insight from the heavens and then is capable of sharing that wisdom or acting upon it to the benefit of his society. This idea is similar to one found in the Indian tradition, where the most important texts, the Vedas, are known as Shruti, or works that were heard through divine revelation and only later written down. Although Confucianism is a venerable world philosophy, it is also highly patriarchal and resulted in the widespread subordination of women. The position of women in China began to change only after the Communist Revolution. While some accounts of Confucianism characterize men and women as emblematic of two opposing forces in the natural world, the yin and the yang, this view of the sexes developed over time and was not consistently applied. Chinese women did see the measure of independence and freedom with the influence of Buddhism and Taoism, each of which had a more liberal view of the role of women. A detailed and important study of the sage tradition in Africa is provided by Henry Odera Oruka, who makes the case that prominent folk sages in African tribal history developed complex philosophical ideas. Oruka interviewed tribal Africans identified by their communities as sages, and he recorded their sayings and ideas, confining himself to those sayings that demonstrated a rational method of inquiry into the real nature of things. He recognized a tension in what made these sages philosophically interesting. They articulated the received wisdom of their tradition and culture while at the same time maintaining a critical distance from that culture, seeking a rational justification for the beliefs held by that culture. Oops, let's take that off for a sec. One sec. Okay, let's turn that. Among the ancient Greeks, it is common to identify seven sages. The best known account is provided by Diogenes Laertius, whose text Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers is a canonical resource on early Greek philosophy. The first and most important sage is Thales of Miletus. Thales traveled to Egypt to study with the Egyptian priests, where he became one of the first Greeks to learn astronomy. He is known for bringing back to Greece knowledge of the calendar, dividing the year into 365 days, tracking the progress of the sun from solstice to solstice, and somewhat dramatically predicting a solar eclipse in 585 BCE. The eclipse occurred on the day of a battle between the Medes and Lydians. It is possible that Thales used knowledge of Babylonian astronomical records to guess the year and location of the eclipse. This mathematical and astronomical feat is one of Thales's several claims to sagacity. In addition, he is said to have calculated the height of the pyramids using the basic geometry of the similar triangles and measuring shadows at a certain time of day. He is also reported to have predicted a particularly good year for olives. He bought up all the olive presses and then made a fortune selling those presses to farmers wanting to turn their olives into oil. Together, these scientific and technical achievements suggested that at least part of Thales's wisdom can be attributed to a very practical scientific and mathematical knowledge of the natural world. If that were all Thales was known for, he might be called the first scientist or engineer. But he also made more basic claims about the nature and composition of the universe. For instance, he claimed that all matter was fundamentally made up of water. He also argued that everything that moved on its own possession a soul, and that the soul itself was immortal. These claims demonstrate a concern about the fundamental nature of reality. Another of the seven sages was Solon, a famed political leader. He introduced the law of release to Athens, which canceled all personal debts and freed indentured servants or debt slaves who had been consigned to service based on a personal debt they were unable to repay. In addition, he established a constitutional government in Athens with a representative body, a procedure for taxation, and a series of economic reforms. He was widely admired as a political leader, but voluntarily stepped down so that he would not become a tyrant. He was finally forced to flee Athens when he was unable to persuade the members of the assembly to resist the rising tyranny of one of his relatives, Pisistratus. When he arrived in exile, he was reportedly asked whom he considered to be happy, to which he replied, "One ought to count no man happy until he is dead." Aristotle interpreted this statement to mean that happiness was not a momentary experience, but a quality reflective of someone's entire life. Beginnings of natural philosophy. The sage tradition is a largely prehistoric tradition that provides a narrative about how intellect, wisdom, piety, and virtue led to the innovations central to flourishing of ancient civilizations. Particularly in Greece, the sage tradition blends into a period of natural philosophy where ancient scientists or philosophers try to explain nature using rational methods. Several of the early Greek schools of philosophy were centered on their respective views of nature. Followers of Thales, known as Milesians, are particularly interested in underlying causes of natural change. Why does water turn to ice? What happens when winter passes into spring? Why does it seem like the stars and planets orbit the Earth in predictable patterns? From Aristotle, we know that Thales thought that there was a difference between material elements that participate in change and elements that contain their own source of motion. This early use of the term element did not have the same meaning as the scientific meaning of the word today in a field like chemistry, but Thales thought material elements bear some fundamental connection to water and that they have the capacity to move and alter their state. By contrast, other elements had their own internal source of motion, of which he cites the magnet and amber. He said that these elements have soul. This notion of soul as a principle of internal motion was influential across ancient and medieval natural philosophy. In fact, the English language words animal and animation are derived from the Latin word for soul. Similarly, early thinkers like Xenophanes began to formulate explanations for natural phenomena. For instance, he explained rainbows, the sun, the moon, and St. Elmo's fire as apparitions of the clouds. This form of explanation, describing some apparent phenomenon as the result of an underlying mechanism, is paradigmatic of scientific explanation even today. Parmenides, the founder of the Eleatic school of philosophy, used logic to conclude that whatever fundamentally exists must be unchanging, because if it ever did, then at least some aspect of it would cease to exist. But that would imply that what exists could not exist, which seems to defy logic. Parmenides is not saying that there is no change, but that the changes we observe are a kind of illusion. Indeed, this point of view was highly influential, not only for Plato and Aristotle, but also for the early atomists like Democritus, who held that all perceived qualities are merely human conventions. Underlying all these appearances, Democritus reasons are only atomic, unchanging bits of matter flowing through the void. While this ancient Greek view of atoms is quite different from the modern model of atoms, the very idea that every observable phenomena has a basis in underlying pieces of matter in various configurations clearly connects modern science to the earliest Greek philosophers. Along these lines, the Pythagoreans provide a very interesting example of a community of philosophers engaged in understanding the natural world and how best to live in it. You may be familiar with Pythagoras from his Pythagorean theorem, a key principle in geometry establishing a relationship between the sides of a right angled triangle. Specifically, the square formed by the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the two squares formed by the remaining two sides. In the figure below, the area of the square formed by C is equal to the sum of the areas of the squares formed by A and B. The figure represents how Pythagoras would have conceptualized the theorem. The Pythagoreans were excellent mathematicians, but they were more interested in how mathematics explained the natural world. In particular, Pythagoras recognized relationships between line segments and shapes, such as the Pythagorean theorem describes, but also between numbers and sounds, by virtue of harmonics and the intervals between notes. Similar regularities can be found in astronomy. As a result, Pythagoras reasoned that all of nature is generated according to mathematical regularities. This view led the Pythagoreans to believe that there was a unified, rational structure to the universe, and that the planets and stars exhibit harmonic properties and may even produce music, that musical tones and harmonies could have healing powers, that the soul is immortal and continuously reincarnated, and that animals possess souls that ought to be respected and valued. As a result, the Pythagorean community was defined by serious scholarship as well as strict rules about diet, clothing, and behavior. Additionally, in the early Pythagorean communities, it was possible for women to participate and contribute to philosophical thought and discovery. Pythagoras himself was said to have been inspired to study philosophy by the Delphic priestess Themistoclea. His wife, Theano, is credited with contributing to important discoveries in the realms of numbers and optics. She is said to have written a treatise on piety, which further applies Pythagorean philosophy to various aspects of practical life. Maya, the daughter of this illustrious couple, was also an active and productive part of the community. At least one of her letters has survived, in which she discusses the application of Pythagorean philosophy to motherhood. The Pythagorean school is an example of how philosophical and scientific thinking combines religious, cultural, and ethical beliefs and practices to embrace many different aspects of life. How it all hangs together. Closer to the present day, in 1962, Wilfrid Sellars, a highly influential 20th century American philosopher, wrote a chapter called Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man in Frontiers of Science and Philosophy. He opens the essay with a dramatic and concise description of philosophy. The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. If we spend some time trying to understand what Sellars means by this definition, we will be in a better position to understand the academic discipline of philosophy. First, Sellars emphasizes that philosophy's goal is to understand a very wide range of topics. In fact, the widest possible range, that is to say, philosophers are committed to understanding everything insofar as it can be understood. This is important because it means that on principle, philosophers cannot rule out any topic of study. However, for a philosopher, not every topic of study deserves equal attention. Some things like conspiracy theories or paranoid delusions are not worth studying because they are not real. Well, according to whom? If it may be worth understanding why some people are prone to paranoid delusions or conspiratorial thinking, but the content of these ideas is not worth investigating. Other things may be factually true, such as the daily change in number of grains of sand on a particular stretch of beach, but they are not worth studying because knowing that information will not teach us about how things hang together. So a philosopher chooses to study things that are informative and interesting, things that provide a better understanding of the world and our place in it. To make judgments about which areas are interesting or worthy of study, philosophers need to cultivate a special skill. Sellars describes his philosophical skill as a kind of know-how. Philosophical know-how, Sellars says, has to do with knowing your way around the world of concepts and being able to understand and think about how concepts connect, link up, support, and rely upon one another. In short, how things hang together. Knowing one's way around the world of concepts also involves knowing where to look to find interesting discoveries and which places to avoid. Much like a good fisherman knows where to cast his line, Sellars acknowledges that other academics and scientists know their way around the concepts in their field of study, much like the philosophers do. The difference is that these other inquirers confine themselves to a specific field of study or a particular subject matter, while philosophers want to understand the whole. Sellers thinks that this philosophical skill is most clearly demonstrated when we try to understand the connection between the natural world as we experience it directly and the natural world as science explains it. He suggests that we gain an understanding of the nature of philosophy by trying to reconcile these two pictures of the world that most people understand independently. Unlike other subjects that have clearly defined subject matter boundaries and relatively clear methods of exploration and analysis, philosophy intentionally lacks clear boundaries or methods. For instance, your biology textbooks will tell you that biology is the science of life. The boundaries of biology are fairly clear. It is an experimental science that studies living things and the associated material necessary for life. Similarly, biology has relatively well defined methods. Biologists, like other experimental scientists, broadly follow something called the scientific method. This is a bit of a misnomer, unfortunately, because there is no single method that all the experimental scientists follow. Nevertheless, biologists have a range of methods and practices, including observation, experimentation, and theory comparison and analysis, that are fairly well established and well known among practitioners. Philosophy doesn't have such easy prescriptions, and for good reason. Philosophers are interested in gaining the broadest possible understanding of things, whether that be nature, what is possible, morals, aesthetics, political organization, or any other field or concept. 1.2. How do philosophers arrive at truth? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify philosophical methods of inquiry, explain the role of logical consequences in assessing a philosophical position, define conceptual analysis, coherence, argument, intuition, and experimental philosophy. Explain the importance of trade offs in establishing a philosophical position. We have seen some examples of how philosophy emerged in antiquity, its relationship to natural philosophy and modern science, and one goal of philosophy, specifically, to provide a coherent story of how the world as it appears to us can be explained in a way that also makes sense of what the sciences tell us. In this section, we describe in greater detail the specific strategies and tools that philosophers use to arrive at truth. Sources of evidence. Even though philosophy is not an empirical science, philosophical claims require evidence, and philosophers ought to have reasons for the claims they make. There are many different types of philosophical evidence, some of which follows. History. A basic but underappreciated source of evidence in philosophy is the history of philosophy. As we have already seen, philosophical thinking has its origins around the world from the beginning of recorded history. Historical philosophers, sages, natural philosophers, and religious thinkers are often a source of insight, inspiration, and argument that can help us understand contemporary philosophical questions. For instance, the Greeks recognized early on that there was a difference between the way we use language to talk about things with generic terms that apply to many different things at the same time, and the things that is, as they actually exist, namely as specific individual beings or objects. Philosophers ask, what is the relationship between the general terms we use and the specific things that exist in the world? This sort of question is a perennial philosophical question. Today's philosophers have their own response to this sort of question, and their answers often respond to and are informed by the historical treatment of these issues. While you may expect questions about the natural world to change over time, questions of morality and social organization do not change as much. What constitutes the good life? How should communities be organized to benefit all the members of that community? These sorts of questions stay with us throughout time. In the United States, it is common for political leaders to appeal to the founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution. People like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington were heavily influenced by early modern European philosophers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Thomas Hobbes. In a similar fashion, the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, is fond of reading and citing the foundational philosopher Confucius. Most of Xi's addresses include quotations from Confucius, and Xi stresses the importance of reading classical Chinese philosophers. For Chinese political leaders, Confucius provides an important reminder of the role of virtue and a sense of belonging among the Chinese people. There is a widespread belief among the Chinese political class that their intellectual heritage is an important factor in their contemporary political success, in much the same way as American political leaders trace their success back to the founding fathers. Given the influence of philosophy on world history, it is worthwhile to engage with the writings of past philosophers to inform our understanding of pressing philosophical questions today. Intuition. One of the hallmarks of philosophical thinking is an appeal to intuition. What philosophers today mean by intuition can best be tracked to Plato, for whom intuition involved a kind of insight into the very nature of things. This notion had religious connotations, as if the knowledge gained through intuition is like catching a glimpse of divine light. But intuition does not mean to involve faith. Rene Descartes defined intuition in the following manner: by intuition, I mean the conception of a clear and attentive mind, which is so easy and distinct that there could be no room for doubt about what we are understanding. This concept of intuition is clearest in mathematical examples. Importantly, it is quite different from the way that many people use the word intuition today to mean something like gut feeling or hunch. When philosophers talk about intuition, they mean something about much more definite. Consider the equation 2 plus 2 equals 4. Examine the equation in your mind. Could it possibly be false? So long as we operate under the assumption that these numbers represent counting numbers, it seems impossible that this equation could be false. More than that, there is a kind of clarity and certainty about the equation. It is not just that you have learned 2 plus 2 equals 4 by habit. You could easily perform the counting operation in your head and verify that the answer is correct. The truth of this mathematical sentence is so clear that if it turned out to be wrong, you would have to give up core beliefs about the nature of numbers, addition, and equality. This kind of clarity is a paradigm of intuition. Intuition operates in other realms beside mathematics, such as the use in language. For instance, it is obvious that a three-legged stool has three legs, or that the tallest building is taller than any other building. These statements are true in an obvious way that is similar to the mathematical sentence above. We can branch out further to say, for instance, that a camel is a mammal. We might intuitively know that this statement is true, but we may also recognize that we are on slightly less certain ground. After all, whether a camel is a mammal is based on some understanding of the anatomy of of a camel, as well as the biological classification system that assigns animals to different classes. So the definition of camel as a mammal is not the same as a three-legged stool has three legs. Here, we can see that some statements are intuitively true by virtue of their definition. Others are intuitively true by virtue of some mental operation that we can perform very easily. Still others are intuitively true in that they rely on a body of knowledge that is commonly accepted and foundational for our understanding of the world. There are many other places outside of pure linguistic analysis and mathematics where intuitions are helpful. Consider morality. The proposition that it is better to be good than to be bad may seem similar to the statement that a three-legged stool has three legs, but the former introduces the words good and bad, which are fraught terms that produce disagreements among people. Nonetheless, while it may be difficult to agree on what constitutes good or bad, everyone probably recognizes that whatever is good ought to be better than what is bad. That seems intuitively true. On this basis, we might imagine that there are intuitive truths even in morality. As we gain confidence in the ability of intuition to reveal truth, we might be tempted to extend intuitions even further. However, when intuitions extend into areas where there is no consensus on what is true, we have to be cautious. At that point, we might be using the term intuition to stand in for belief or perspective. Such intuitions do not have the same force as the intuition that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It is not always easy to distinguish between intuitions that are certain and evident and those that are merely feelings or hunches. Recognizing that distinction is part of the practical know-how philosophers try to develop. Common sense. We ought not to neglect a third source of evidence in philosophy, namely common sense. The idea of common sense is frequently used to describe a basic set of facts or common knowledge that any adult human being ought to possess. But common sense is rarely defined. When philosophers talk about common sense, they mean specific claims based on direct sense perception, which are true in a relatively fundamental sense. In other words, philosophical champions of common sense deny that one can be skeptical of certain basic claims of sense perception. Famously, early 20th century British philosopher G.E. Moore argued that a perfectly rigorous proof of the external world could be given by simply making the appropriate gesture toward his right hand and saying, "Here is one hand." So long as it is granted that the sensory perception of a hand is evidence of the existence of a hand and that there is such a thing as a hand in the external world, then it must be granted that there is an external world. Such an argument trades on the idea that knowledge of the existence of one's own hands is something that does not need further proof. It is something that we can know without proof. This idea is not something that all philosophers accept, but it is, in many cases, an important source of evidence in philosophical inquiry. At a certain point, it may be necessary to stop demanding proofs for the things we can plainly see, such as the fact that this is a hand. Common sense may be questioned by further philosophical interrogation, but the common sense philosopher may respond that such interrogation is either unnecessary, excessive, or misses the point. Experimental philosophy. Experimental philosophy is a relatively recent movement in philosophy in which philosophers engage in empirical methods of investigation, similar to those used by psychologists or cognitive scientists. The basic idea motivating experimental philosophy is that philosophers use terms and concepts that can be tested in a laboratory. For instance, when philosophers talk about free will, they frequently cite the idea that free will is necessary to assign moral responsibility. Thus, moral responsibility is one reason to believe in the existence of free will. Consequently, you might wonder whether most people do, in fact, believe that the existence of free will is necessary to assign moral responsibility. This claim can be tested, for instance, by posing problems or scenarios to research subjects and asking them whether the absence of free choice removes moral responsibility. Similar strategies have been applied to causation, philosophy of biology, consciousness, personal identity, and so forth. In these areas, philosophers use experimental methods to find out what average people think about philosophical issues. Since common sense and intuition are already a source of evidence in philosophical reasoning, it makes sense to confirm that what philosophers ascribe to common sense or intuition aligns with what people generally think about these things. Such experimental research is subject to many of the same issues that confront experimentation in the social sciences. These studies need to be replicable and ought to fall within a psychological or biological theory that helps explain them. When philosophers tread into experimental philosophy, they behave a lot more like scientists than philosophers, and they are held to the same rigorous standards as other researchers in similar experimental disciplines. Results from other disciplines. The relevance of experimental methods for philosophy suggests a broader source of evidence for philosophical claims, namely, the results of scientific disciplines. When philosophers make claims about the natural world, they ought to be aware of what the natural sciences say. When philosophers make claim about human nature, they ought to be aware of what biology and the social sciences say. As we have already seen, there is an important difference between philosophical investigation and these various disciplines. Yet, given that philosophers attempt to gain some understanding of truth as a whole, they ought to welcome evidence from other disciplines that can help them better understand portions of that whole truth. Logic. One of the first and most reliable ways that philosophers have of verifying and analyzing claims is by using logic, which is in some sense the science of reasoning. Logic attempts to formalize the process that we use or ought to use when we provide reasons for some claims. By interpreting the claims we make using logic, we can assess whether those claims are well founded and consistent or whether they are poorly reasoned. The chapter on logic and reasoning will provide much more detail about the nature of logic and how it is used by philosophers to arrive at truth. I'll be right back. I'm going to go check the timer on the oven. All right, I'm back. Argument. The first and most important move in logic is to recognize that claims are the product of arguments. In particular, a claim is just the conclusion of a series of sentences where the preceding sentences provide evidence for the conclusion. In logic, an argument is just a way of formalizing reasons to support a claim, where the claim is the conclusion and the reasons given are the premises. In normal conversation and even philosophical writing, arguments are rarely written so clearly that one can easily identify the premises and the conclusion. Nevertheless, it is possible to reconstruct any argument as a series of sentences with clearly identified premises and conclusions. This process is the first step in analyzing an argument. Identify the claim that is being made, then identify the sentences that provide supporting evidence for that argument. This process will necessarily require some interpretation on the part of the reader. Therefore, it is important to try to remain faithful to the original intention of the argument and outline the premises and conclusion in such a way that they display the reasoning of the person making that claim. Once the premises and conclusion are identified and written in order, it is possible to use formal techniques to evaluate the argument. Formal techniques will be covered in the chapter on logic and reasoning. For now, it is sufficient to note that there is a process for evaluating whether claims are well supported by those using the techniques of logic. Poorly supported claims may be true, but without good reasons to accept those claims, a person's support of them is irrational. In philosophy, we want to understand and evaluate the reasons for a claim. Just as a house that is built without a solid foundation will rapidly deteriorate and eventually fall, the philosopher who accepts claims without good reasons is likely to hold a system of beliefs that will crumble. Explanation. While arguments can be thought of as building blocks to construct a solid foundation for beliefs about the world, arguments can also be understood as explanations for phenomena that are evident but not well understood. To generate well founded beliefs, we start with evidence in the form of premises and infer a conclusion from the evidence. To explain observed phenomena, we start with a conclusion in the form of some observation and reason backward to the evidence that explains why the observation is true. For example, we infer that there is a fire based on the appearance of smoke, or we infer lightning when we hear thunder, even if we do not see the lightning. We can compare the way we reason about explanations to the way a detective might reconstruct a crime based on the evidence found at a crime scene. By reconstructing the premises that led to a given conclusion, a philosopher can explain the reasons for a conclusion that are evident through observation. In summary, logical reconstruction can be used to investigate the world around us, providing a rational explanation for why the world is the way it appears. Coherence. Finally, logic provides philosophers with a powerful technique for assessing a set of claims or beliefs. We can ask whether a set of beliefs is logically consistent with one another. Given that we expect our beliefs to present to us a world that makes rational sense, we want those beliefs to be internally consistent. A set of beliefs or statements is coherent or logically consistent if it is possible for them to be all true at the same time. If it is not possible for statements or beliefs to be true at the same time, then they are contradictory. It seems unreasonable for a person to accept contradictory claims because a contradiction is a logical impossibility. If a person holds contradictory beliefs, then they must be wrong about at least some of their beliefs. Metaphorically, the house of beliefs in which they live must be poorly founded, at least in some places. When you are reading philosophy, you should be aware of places where the author says things that appear to be inconsistent. If you discover inconsistencies, that is a good indication that at least one of their claims is false. You may not know which claim is false, but you can know it is logically impossible for all claims to be true. When faced with the possibility of incoherent beliefs, the philosopher will need to either revise those beliefs so that they can become consistent, or they will need to give up some beliefs to preserve others. Logical consistency cannot tell us that a set of beliefs is true. A complete fiction might be logically consistent, but logical consistency can tell us what is not true. It is impossible for a logical inconsistent set of beliefs to be wholly true. Conceptual analysis. One of the techniques that philosophers use to clarify and understand philosophical statements is conceptual analysis. Conceptual analysis involves the analysis of concepts, notions, or ideas as they are presented in statements or sentences. The term analysis has been part of the philosophical terminology and methodology since its beginning. It is its most basic sense. Analysis refers to the process of breaking apart complex ideas into simpler ones. Analysis also involves a cluster of related strategies that philosophers use to discover truths. Each of these techniques attempts to arrive at a clearer and more workable definition of the concepts in question. When students are asked to give definition of some concept or term, they frequently go to a dictionary, but a dictionary provides only a description of how a concept is used in ordinary speech. A dictionary cannot tell us what the word means in a fundamental sense because dictionary definitions never ask what the common uses that never ask whether that common usage is coherent, accurate, or precise. It is up to the person engaged in reflection on the concept to figure out what the term means and whether that meaning fits within the larger understanding of the world. The next section illustrates 4 methods of analysis. Predicates. When philosophers today talk about concepts, they are usually referring to a notion that comes from the work on logic done by German philosopher Gottlob Frege. Frege demonstrated that any sentence in natural language could be translated into a formal symbolic language, provided that we consider the sentence to be a kind of function that describes a relationship between names and concepts. This symbolic language is what has become modern logic. Frege modeled his logic on mathematics with the idea that he could eliminate the ambiguity and vagueness of natural language by translating it into a purely symbolic notation. Following Frege, we can break sentences into parts, including names or object identifiers and concepts or predicates. Predicates are descriptive terms like yellow, 6 feet tall, or faster than a speeding bullet. Simple sentences like the flower is yellow or Superman is faster than a speeding bullet can be easily analyzed into object terms and predicates, but any sentence can be analyzed in multiple ways, and some sentences express multiple relations between predicates and objects. So the role of conceptual analysis is to identify the right predicates for analysis and to clarify the relationship between them. Predicates can help us clarify statements. For any sentence, we can ask what is being predicated and how is it being predicated. Descriptions. While the concepts that describe or categorize objects can be analyzed using predicates, the objects themselves can be analyzed by using descriptions. Bertrand Russell identified definite descriptions as the way to analyze proper names or objects. His idea is that the sentence like the flower is yellow or my dog likes naps, the subject term flower or dog can be substituted with a descriptive sentence that uniquely identifies this particular flower or dog. There are unique characteristics that differentiate my dog from all others. For instance, my dog was born on a certain day, lives in a certain city, belongs to me, or occupies a certain specific location. Similarly, the flower can be identified by its position in a garden, field, or particular geographical location. One of Russell's insights was the proper names, such as Max, are definite descriptions in disguise. That is, any proper name can be substituted with a description that identifies the one and only thing named. A definite description is a way of analyzing names and object terms for the purpose of making them more like predicates. This way, we can clarify what we are talking about without resorting to gestures, context, or direct experience. You probably do this in your everyday life when you encounter confusion about a name. For instance, suppose a coworker says, Kevin used up all your paper in the printer. Used up all the paper in the printer. If there's more than one Kevin in the office, you might answer, which Kevin? And your coworker may then respond, the one with brown hair whose workspace is right next to the entrance. Oh, you might reply, you mean the one with his picture of his kids on his desk? In a sense, this process of disambiguating the reference for the name Kevin is a process of seeking a more definite description to supplement the proper name. Understanding that language is composed of definite descriptions and predicates can help us remove some of the ambiguity and vagueness that is a natural part of speech. Enumeration. Sometimes to understand the meaning of a concept, it is helpful to enumerate its component parts. For instance, we may say that a government body is composed of its legislature, its executive, and its judicial branches. Or we might recognize that a cell is composed of a nucleus, a cell wall, and organelles. The process of enumeration can help us specify the nature of the thing that we are talking about. In effect, we are identifying the parts that make up a whole. Since claims about the whole can be analyzed as claims about its parts and claims about how the parts pertain to the whole, it is helpful to enumerate the parts and consider how claims about the whole relate to claims about the parts. Just as enumeration is helpful in understanding material things, it can be used to understand abstract concepts. For example, Aristotle says that wisdom is composed of scientific knowledge plus understanding, where understanding is the grasp of first principles and scientific knowledge is the grasp of demonstrated reasoning that follows from first principles. Whether or not Aristotle is correct, his enumeration may help us understand the nature of wisdom. Thought experiments. When philosophers want to clarify the relationship between concepts, they often consider hypothetical scenarios meant to isolate one or more features of a concept and place it in the appropriate relationship with other concepts. Such hypothetical scenarios are called thought experiments. These imaginative scenarios allow or test or compare concepts to better understand their connections and logical consequences. Philosophers have used thought experiments for as long as we have the written record of philosophical thought. For instance, Plato devised an elaborate thought experiment in the Republic, in which he depicts Socrates and several of his friends as describing an ideal city. The premise of this thought experiment is that if the philosophers could describe an ideal city in detail, they would be able to identify which part of the city gives rise to justice. All right, I'm going to call that good for now because food is done. So I'm on page 32. So this is the end of part 1 of chapter 1 of Introduction to Philosophy.